There is a particular kind of nervousness that belongs only to the first weeks of a new career, the trembling just beneath the surface of the skin, a heart that beats a little too fast even during the quiet hours, a mind that runs through every possible mistake before it has even had the chance to make one. Emily Carpenter knew that nervousness well. She was 24 years old, 3 weeks into her very first nursing position at Fairview Memorial Hospital, and she still had not learned to walk through those double doors each morning without a small flutter of doubt asking her quietly whether she truly belonged there at all. She had wanted to be a nurse since she was 7 years old. Since the winter her grandfather had been hospitalized with pneumonia, and a kind patient nurse named Dorothy had sat with young Emily in the waiting room, teaching her how to fold paper cranes to pass the anxious hours. Emily still remembered the particular gentleness in that woman's voice, the way she had made a frightened little girl feel, for just a moment, that everything difficult in the world could still be handled with softness. Emily had carried that memory with her through every difficult exam, every long night of studying, every moment of doubt across the 6 years it had taken her to finally earn her place on Fairview's medical floor. But knowing you belong somewhere and feeling it are two very different things, and in her 3rd week, feeling it still eluded her. The older nurses on her unit were kind enough, in the distracted way that busy, experienced people are kind to newcomers. A nod here, a quick piece of advice there, rarely with the time to explain the deeper reasoning behind it. Emily absorbed what she could, made her small mistakes quietly, corrected them as best she was able, and told herself most nights on her drive home that competence would come with time, the way it always did for everyone who came before her. It was on a gray Tuesday morning in late autumn, with rain tapping softly against the windows the way it does in that particular season when summer has fully surrendered and winter has not yet arrived, that Emily was assigned a new patient, a man who had just been transferred up from the emergency department, following what the chart described only briefly as combat-related injury, non-critical, requiring observation. His name was Jack Bowman, 38 years old. A veteran, according to the intake notes, though the details of his service were sparse, the kind of gaps in a chart that suggested either classified circumstances or simply a patient who had not wished to share more than necessary. What the chart did make clear, in careful clinical language, was this: Mr. Bowman was profoundly deaf, the result of an explosion during his final deployment, and he communicated primarily through American Sign Language and written notes. Emily had taken exactly 1 semester of introductory sign language in college, a decision made almost on a whim when she needed an elective and a friend had recommended it. She remembered perhaps a dozen signs with any real confidence. Hello, thank you, pain, help, water, the barest scaffolding of a language she had never expected to need so urgently, so soon in her very first month of real nursing. When Emily entered the room, she found Jack Bowman sitting upright in his hospital bed, his eyes immediately alert, scanning her face and her hands with the sharp, practiced attentiveness of someone who has learned, through hard necessity, to read a room entirely through sight. There was something in his posture, a tension held carefully in his shoulders, a wariness in his eyes that told Emily, even before she understood the fuller story, that this was a man who had learned to brace himself for how the hearing world might treat him. She smiled, the way she always did, gently, and reached for the small whiteboard she had grabbed from the nurses' station on instinct, some quiet part of her, recognizing that the usual soft reassurances she offered her patients, "You're going to be just fine. Honey, we'll take good care of you," would mean nothing at all if he could not hear them spoken. She wrote in careful block letters, "You are safe. I will not touch you without warning you first." She held it up for him to read, watching his face carefully for whatever reaction might follow. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite relief, not yet, but the first loosening of a tension that had clearly been wound tight since the moment he'd been wheeled through the hospital's doors. He studied the words for a long moment, then looked up at Emily's face and gave the smallest, most careful of nods. Outside the room, in the hallway visible through the wide observation window, a small crowd had begun to gather, the way small crowds sometimes do in hospitals when something unusual, Something worth watching presents itself amid the ordinary rhythm of the day. Two men in tactical gear, Navy SEALs, judging by the patches on their uniforms, evidently friends or fellow servicemen who had accompanied Jack to the hospital, stood near the door, their arms crossed, their expressions unreadable. Behind them, doctors and nurses from the surrounding floor had paused in their own rounds, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps by something more complicated than curiosity, a kind of skepticism that Emily could feel pressing gently against the window glass even from where she stood. She heard faintly, through the door left slightly ajar, the murmur of voices, not unkind exactly, but doubtful, the particular doubt that experienced people sometimes carry toward those who are new. "She's what, 3 weeks in?" one of the older nurses murmured to another just outside. "Bless her heart, but she doesn't even know sign language properly. How's she supposed to manage a patient like this?" Emily heard it. She felt the familiar flutter of doubt rise in her chest, the same doubt that had followed her through every first week, every unfamiliar task. But she also remembered something her grandmother used to say in the kitchen of the old farmhouse where Emily had spent so many childhood summers, flour dust catching the afternoon light. "You don't need to know everything, sweetheart. You just need to be willing to learn right there in the moment with whoever's in front of you." So Emily turned back to Jack Bowman, set the doubt aside as best she could, and began, patiently, imperfectly, to communicate. She used the signs she knew with careful precision, filling the gaps with gestures, with written notes on the whiteboard, with the kind of patient, unhurried attentiveness that comes not from expertise but from genuine care. When she didn't know a sign, she simply wrote the word instead, watching his face for understanding, adjusting when she saw confusion, slowing down when she saw him struggling to follow. It took nearly 20 minutes to complete what would normally have been a 5-minute intake assessment. Emily was aware the whole time of the small audience gathered beyond the window, aware of the quiet murmur of skepticism she imagined, continuing out there without her. But she found, to her own quiet surprise, that once she settled into the actual work of communicating with Jack, once she stopped worrying about how she appeared and focused instead on simply reaching him, the nervousness that had followed her through her first 3 weeks began, slowly, to fall away. Jack, for his part, watched her with an expression that shifted gradually across those 20 minutes, from wariness to careful attention to something that might have been the beginning of trust. When Emily finished checking his vitals, narrating each step first on the whiteboard, waiting for his nod before she touched him, exactly as she had promised, he reached for the small notepad on his bedside table and wrote something himself, sliding it across to her. "Most people just talk at me. Loud, like volume is the problem. You're the first one who's actually tried to meet me where I am." Emily felt something warm rise in her chest reading those words. She wrote back, "I'm still learning. I only know a little sign language. I'm sorry if I got some of it wrong." Jack shook his head slightly and wrote, "You got the important part right." It was perhaps an hour later, during a quiet lull in the afternoon, that the full weight of who Jack Bowman was, and why 2 armed, watchful Navy SEALs stood guard outside his door, and why a small crowd of medical staff had gathered with such evident curiosity, finally became clear. One of the men in tactical gear, a broad-shouldered man with a weathered face and a quiet, watchful authority, stepped into the room while Emily was adjusting Jack's IV line, and gestured with practiced fluency in sign language directed at his friend. Jack responded in kind, his hands moving with the easy grace of a first language, faster than Emily could follow, though she caught enough scattered words, nurse, good, patient, to understand that whatever was being discussed involved her. The SEAL, whose name tag read Garrett, turned to Emily afterward and spoke aloud, his voice carrying a rough, careful respect. "Ma'am, I don't think you understand who you're looking after." Emily set down the IV line, uncertain. "I'm sorry?" "Jack was our team's combat medic," Garrett said. 15 years of service. He lost his hearing in an explosion that also took the life of one of our teammates, a blast that Jack ran directly into, without hesitation, to pull 2 wounded men to safety before the whole structure came down. He kept working on us, kept his hands steady, kept us alive, even after the explosion took his hearing completely mid-rescue. He didn't even know in that moment that the world had gone silent around him. He just kept doing the job. Garrett paused, something thick in his voice. There isn't a man on our team who's alive today without what Jack Bowman did for us that day. And most people who meet him now, they see the deafness first, and they forget entirely what kind of man is standing in front of them. Emily looked at Jack, who was watching this exchange carefully, reading Garrett's lips and the shape of the conversation with the particular skill of someone who has learned to navigate a hearing world through every available means. I didn't know, Emily said quietly. I'm sorry. I should have. Jack reached for his notepad and wrote quickly. You didn't need to know my history to treat me like a person. That's rarer than you'd think. Word of the exchange moved through the floor the way such stories always do, quietly at first and then less quietly, until by the end of Emily's shift, several of the very nurses who had murmured their doubts outside Jack's door that morning found reasons to stop by, to offer small, sheepish compliments, to admit in the particular way experienced people sometimes admit to underestimating someone new, that they had been wrong to doubt her. Diane Ashworth, the head nurse of the floor, a woman in her late 50s who had trained dozens of new nurses across a long career and had grown, perhaps a little too, comfortable in her own certainty about who would sink and who would swim, found Emily near the end of the shift, restocking a supply cart in the quiet hallway. I heard about this morning, Diane said. With the veteran, Mr. Bowman. Emily braced herself, expecting criticism. The gentle but firm correction of a supervisor, pointing out everything a rookie nurse had done imperfectly. Instead, Diane's face carried something softer. I've worked this floor for 26 years, she said. I've seen nurses with twice your experience freeze up in front of patients. Like him, not out of unkindness, but out of fear of getting it wrong. You didn't let that fear stop you. You just did the work imperfectly, patiently, right in front of him, and let him see you trying. She shook her head slightly, a small, genuine smile forming. That's not something we can really teach in nursing school, you know. That's something you either have in you or you don't. I almost didn't go in there, Emily admitted. I heard what people were saying outside the door. I thought maybe they were right, that I wasn't ready. Diane's expression softened further, something maternal and warm settling into it. Sweetheart, none of us are ever fully ready, not really. Not on day one, and honestly, not even 20 years in. You just show up anyway. And you let the caring do the work the training hasn't caught up to yet. That's the whole secret. If there is one. She squeezed Emily's shoulder gently. You did good today. Really good. Over the following days, as Jack Bowman remained at Fairview, memorial for observation and the gradual healing of a minor injury sustained in the same operation that had, weeks earlier, brought him further harm than the hospital chart initially revealed. Emily continued as his primary nurse at his own quiet request. Their communication improved daily, Emily practicing new signs each evening at home, looking them up carefully, bringing back small new phrases each morning that made Jack's tired eyes brighten with quiet appreciation. Jack, in turn, began teaching her more complex signs during the slow hours of his recovery, patient in the particular way that people who have had to work hard for understanding often become patient teachers themselves. You didn't have to learn all this, he wrote to her one afternoon, watching her practice a new phrase with careful concentration. Most nurses just use the whiteboard and call it good enough. Emily considered this for a moment before writing back. My grandfather used to say that meeting someone halfway isn't really meeting them at all. You have to be willing to go the distance yourself, or it isn't real effort. I figured if you'd learned to survive in a hearing world your whole life, the least I could do was learn a little of yours. Jack read this slowly, and something in his weathered face, a face that had clearly carried more hardship than most people twice his age, softened into an expression of genuine warmth. Your grandfather sounds like he was a wise man, he wrote. He was, Emily wrote back. He passed when I was in nursing school. I think about him every single shift. On the day of his discharge, nearly 2 weeks after that first uncertain morning, Jack Bowman asked Garrett to help him communicate one final message to Emily, wanting to be certain nothing was lost between the signs and the words. "Tell her," Jack signed, Garrett translating aloud as Emily stood quietly listening, "that in 15 years of service, and in all the months since I lost my hearing, she is the first medical professional who ever asked me before doing anything what I needed, instead of simply deciding for me what I needed, the way so many well-meaning people do." He paused, his hands continuing their careful, deliberate movement. "Tell her that kind of respect is rarer than courage in my experience, and I've seen a great deal of courage." Emily felt her eyes fill, standing there in the quiet hallway of a hospital floor that had, over 3 short weeks, slowly begun to feel like it truly belonged to her. "Please tell him," she said softly, and Garrett began translating her words into sign as she spoke, "that he taught me more in 2 weeks than most of my training did in 6 years. That I'll carry what he taught me into every single patient I ever look after for the rest of my career, and that I hope, wherever he goes from here, that people learn to see the whole of him, not just what he's lost, but everything he's given." Jack Bowman left Fairview Memorial that afternoon, walking tall between his 2 SEAL teammates, the autumn sun finally breaking through, weeks of gray clouds to fall, in warm golden light across the hospital's front steps. Before he left, he turned back one final time, found Emily watching from the doorway, and offered her a small, respectful salute. Not the formal military gesture exactly, but something gentler, more personal, a private acknowledgement between 2 people who had found a way to truly see each other across a divide that so many others had failed to cross. Emily returned to her rounds that afternoon with a steadiness she had not felt since her very first day, the last trembling doubts of her early weeks finally, quietly settling into something more like confidence. Not the loud, certain confidence of expertise, but the softer, more durable confidence of someone who has learned firsthand that showing up with an open heart matters more than showing up with all the answers. She thought often in the years that followed about that gray Tuesday morning, about the whiteboard she had grabbed almost on instinct, about the small crowd of doubtful faces gathered outside a hospital room door, and about the quiet lesson her grandmother had once offered her in a farmhouse kitchen filled with the smell of Sunday morning bread. "You don't need to know everything, sweetheart. You just need to be willing to learn, right there in the moment, with whoever's in front of you." It had taken a deaf war hero, a handful of imperfect signs, and one uncertain morning, in her 3rd week of nursing for Emily Carpenter, to finally understand in her bones just how true that lesson really was, and to carry it forward, gently, faithfully, into every single patient who came through her doors for the rest of a long and quietly remarkable career.